once those midterms are over, once the energy reserves are replenished, once the weapons are restocked after a little while, there could be another resumption of war by the United States. This is from a tweet I wrote in January. It was in response to another tweet that someone had written suggesting that the U.S. was seriously moving towards regime change war in Iran. Let me read it for you. Iraq was already fragmented, and the U.S. spent a year gathering troops in Kuwait and elsewhere to launch an invasion that changed the regime, but almost immediately created, probably a better word is triggered, a non-stop series of crises that damaged the entire planet and continues to haunt the world. Iran is unfragmented, triple the size and population of Iraq in 2003, pretty well armed, and the U.S. has not really enough troops in the region nor support back home for an actual regime change operation. The real question for journalists and analysts is what snaky charlatans from which shady think tanks and foreign governments are providing Trump and his team with the bad intel that makes him think that this is going to be some kind of cakewalk. So here we now are basically almost 7 months after I wrote that, and this was before the war. This was as the war was building steam, as it was becoming obvious to serious analysts that a war was coming. And look where we are now. And I think that what I anticipated and what many anticipated was that Iran would not put up this much of a fight, that the regime could easily collapse in a regime change war. Many of us believed that the U.S. was much more powerful than it was, that a war would lead to some kind of toppling of the regime or major destabilization of the regime. Remember back then, that was in January, just after those explosive protests throughout the country against the regime in which thousands of people were killed, including some police officers, and there were attacks on police stations and other government institutions and so on. So everyone thought that the Iranian regime would not last at all. And in fact, this war that they launched has made the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic, even stronger and probably given it a degree of legitimacy. Historical legitimacy has given this reign a degree of historical legitimacy that it has not had before. I'm Borzu Deragahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands. You can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. You can also find me at Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on YouTube. So over the weekend, there was more and more fleshing out of this Memorandum of Understanding, Part 2, between the U.S. and Iran. The Iranians issued a series of very bold red lines saying that the Strait of Hormuz would only be reopened basically if the U.S. went back to the promises that it gave in the Memorandum of Understanding that was abandoned by the Trump administration. Basically, what the Iranian regime is saying is that you're not going to get better than what you offered back then. That the Memorandum of Understanding, as everyone understood it, was rather advantageous to Iran, at least on paper, if it were to be fully implemented. And the Iranians are saying, oh, so now you've attacked our southern flank. Now you've done these more and more aggressive attacks on like Eshem Island and Bandar Abbas, and you've gone after our Navy more and you've reimposed the blockade. Now you think you're going to get a better deal for that? No. You're going to get a worse deal. And to punctuate that statement, that bold statement outlining these 6 or 7 demands by the Supreme National Security Council was concomitant with this escalation in the conflict in Yemen, in the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, with more and more attacks by the Yemeni Houthi forces allied with Iran against Saudi Arabian energy installations, and what appears to be an increase in ground activities between forces loyal to Saudi Arabia and those Houthi forces on the ground in Yemen. So a reigniting of that horrible civil war in Yemen. And later on in this episode, I have a couple of interviews in which I talk about the Memorandum of Understanding Part 2, well as the escalating crisis in Yemen and around Yemen. And I spoke about both in a couple of interviews with India's NewsX World. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about what I was mentioning earlier in the introduction here about the increased legitimacy that this war has given the Islamic Republic. When you think about Iranian history, it's like one of the things that is recurrent in that history is these invasions from foreign forces, these either horrific invasions, either by the Arab Muslims that came and they basically conquered Persia in the Middle Ages, and then the Mongols that came again and conquered the country. And then later on, the Russians and the British and the Americans, these colonial powers that pretty much came into Iran and took it over and took away its independence and sovereignty and did whatever they want. That all culminated in the 20th century, at least, in the revolution of 1978, 1979, which was not originally meant as an Islamist revolution, but the Islamists were probably among, if not the most powerful force in that revolution, and they took control of it. But they also had that mandate, independence. And the Iranian regime has been steadfast about that from the very beginning in its rhetoric, if not in its actions, that no country other than Iran will decide the country's future. And then you had this war that many thought, even me, I thought that it was going to turn into Libya 2.0 or Syria or something. I thought that if the United States decided on regime change, especially if Israel was giving a helping hand, and that would do it for it. And I think a lot of people thought, and I think maybe even in the Islamic Republic's leadership itself, they didn't think that they would perform as well as they did in the conflict. Yes, there was a lot of damage. There was a lot of material damage by the Americans, but the Iranians clearly played a better game of chess. I've said this before, if you play chess, you know that you can lose a lot of pieces and still get your opponent in checkmate. You move one pawn to the other side of the chessboard and it becomes a queen, and you've got maybe one rook left. He could have a whole bunch of pieces, a couple of knights even, and you can still win if you play a very good game. And that's essentially what has happened in the Persian Gulf. Iranians checkmated the Americans. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it at this point. It's become clear, especially with the Memorandum of Understanding emerging. And I think that this has broader implications. I think for one thing, it has huge implications for the United States. It's not a paper tiger. It hasn't been revealed as a paper tiger, but its comical foibles are being seen around the world. Its inability, like these con men like Pete Hegseth, these clowns that are running the country, maybe not so much Marco Rubio, but definitely Donald Trump himself, his real estate buddy, Steve Witkoff, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, these clowns and their incompetence and stupidity are being seen all around the world. And their defeat, their utter strategic defeat in the Persian Gulf is being seen all around the world. And so I don't know if you realize this, but, I spent a lot of my time abroad and I live in Paris and Istanbul mostly. The world is laughing at you, America. They're laughing at you. They're laughing at what incompetent clowns you are. I mean, just take that in, okay? If you're an American, like the world, you're the butt of the world's jokes. You have this crazed, egocentric narcissist in the White House who's shitting in his pants, essentially, live on camera, and his deputies are a bunch of ass clowns as well. The world is laughing at the United States. And I think a lot of the invincibility, the aura of invincibility that was very damaged by the Iraq war, especially on the part of Iraqis who saw for themselves just what incompetent losers many Americans are, inconsistencies, the hypocrisy, the incompetence, the corruption of the American structure and infrastructure of the American way of doing things. It just became apparent to many Iraqis. Now it's become apparent to the entire world. And I just think people should just sit with that for a second. Like this image of America as like this benevolent superpower that's able to do, it's completely tattered. America's brand is shit. And you can thank your MAGA hero, Donald Trump, for that if you voted for him. But as for Iran, I think that this war, I think unfortunately for those of us who would like to see the Islamic Republic kind of fade away, or at least change in a radical way and allow more freedom and civil liberties in the country and allow the country to become a more pluralistic place where people have their rights respected and it's not arbitrary and the regime is not this malevolent force towards the people. I think that this war gives the Islamic Republic a kind of renewal of its legitimacy because it managed to do what many of Iran's imperial leaders of the past, many of its kings and rulers of the past failed to do. It managed to fend off what was an incredible military force. And I think that that is going to have repercussions. I think the Islamic Republic is going to be able to bank this victory against the Americans and the Israelis for some time. Hopefully, it will lead to some confidence on the part of the Islamic Republic, and it will become a more assured government, at least with regard to its own people and its neighbors, and not engage in the kind of acting out that it does. I hope it would make it seem to the regime that it does not need to be addicted to the death penalty and put any dissident to death and not warehouse its smartest and most talented political activists in Evin prison. I would hope that that would be the conclusion of this victory, but I kind of doubt it. I think it'll make them more bold and arrogant at this point and make them more transgressive. And I see bad things for Iran in that respect, although there are some good signs too in the social aspects. But I think another thing that is a kind of mixed blessing possibly from this war, the silver lining of this war, is that if the Americans gracefully accept the outcome of this conflict, I think it could be really good for the U.S. I think that the version of Pax Americana that is this muscular, peak Hegseth-esque, militaristic vision of the American future is a very flawed one and a very expensive one and a very stupid one. America could get a lot more friends and allies and power worldwide with its brands and its entertainment industry and its talents and its tech industry and its model of immigration and assimilation. I think it could do a lot better by promoting that and using that to its advantage. Like if it was more like, I don't know, like the UK or Japan that are just like attractive places because they're attractive and what they produce is attractive. Maybe not so much Japan, but like Korea is a great brand. Sweden is a great brand. And it's not a great brand because they it's a great brand because they make good stuff that people like and people want to visit there and people want to go there. I think this dark militaristic version of America that is prevalent under Donald Trump is a disaster. As for Iran, I think that this conflict, this victory will give the Islamic Republic a certain degree of power and standing on the world stage. I think people like that University of Chicago professor Robert Pape have talked about this, that it is, I don't know if it's going to emerge as a fourth center of world power. Its brand has been improved as the country that stood up to the United States and Israel and managed to draw them to some kind of stalemate. There is still a lot of damage that is being done to the Iranian economy and to Iranian society. The blockade is still on. But I think that this particular regime has shown that it is so adaptable to sanctions and so adaptable to things like blockades that it will surmount these obstacles and the regime will be in power for a long time. This is the hope that I have, is that the regime believes itself that it will stay in power for a long time. It won't be so insecure. Half of what the regime does is because it is paranoid that it will be destroyed the same way the Shah's regime was destroyed, the way Saddam Hussein's regime was destroyed, the way Libya's Muammar Gaddafi was destroyed. Half of what it does is because of that, because of its various fears and paranoia. It is the most paranoid regime, and they have whole think tanks devoted to ways of defending the regime against an external or internal actor. They've thought a lot about this, and clearly they did their homework, as we saw in this current war. So I think that that is something to talk about and think about. I would love to hear other people's thoughts about this. I'm not a historian. I know Iran's history pretty well, but I think that that is kind of unique in Iranian history. A government or leadership regime, whatever you want to call it, that managed to fend off such a ferocious attack, that managed to come up with the strategy that put the world's superpower, the world's hyperpower, the United States, the Rome cubed of our current era, managed to put them into sort of a check or checkmate, or at least a stalemate. That is kind of unprecedented. Vietnam was a different kind of situation. There was no actual threat to the U.S. economy and to U.S. rule and the world economy the way that Iran has put the United States into check, managed to threaten the United States. Anyway, just some thoughts here. I am in Paris right now, just overcoming some jet lag. I will be in this hemisphere for the coming months, going back to Istanbul in a couple weeks. Right now, why don't you listen in on this interview about the latest, I don't know what you would call them, the latest emerging peace talks between Iran and Oman, with the U.S. kind of watching on the sidelines and trying to get advantages from it.
And we are hearing many comments, leaders of Iran and coming out on interviews and giving statements. How much leverage does Iran hold realistically over Oman and the wider Gulf if commercial shipping remains restricted, as we are entering apparently a very close end to this deal between Oman and Iran?
Well, it doesn't hold that much leverage over Oman just because Oman, if you look at a map, has alternative routes. It does abut both the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, as well as the Gulf of Oman on the other side, and has easier access to the Indian Ocean and international trade routes. But Oman, insofar as it is acting as a kind of leader for the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, Iran has quite a bit of leverage over those countries because it does have this control over the Strait of Hormuz. It does have this geography, and it also has shown a willingness to use that geography, to weaponize that geography, to prevent ships from going in and out. But I think that really the biggest leverage that Iran has is with the United States, because it knows, and the world by now knows, that the U.S. is facing a shortage of munitions, a shortage of interceptor stockpile, as well as a shortage of oil, declining stockpiles and declining reserves of oil and petroleum. And that is causing the United States to allow these negotiations to unfold, to accede to probably to certain Iranian demands, because as Donald Trump has said repeatedly, he doesn't want to be Herbert Hoover. He doesn't want to preside over a global economic collapse. And that's what would happen if the world's energy reserves run out because the Iranians keep the Strait of Hormuz closed.
Of course. And like you mentioned just a moment ago about what do they have over the US, Iran says that this agreement is closed. And reopening of Hormuz still depends on US concessions. And they even brought up the MOU that was signed a couple of months ago. Is Iran using the Straits as its biggest bargaining chip, would you say, against the US to force the US into a broader political deal, do you think?
I don't know about a broader political deal. I think perhaps a broader economic deal and a package of incentives is what Iran really wants. And at this point, we're in the bargaining phase. You have two parties with other mediators and interlocutors interceding on behalf of each, essentially in a marketplace, negotiating over the terms of a potential deal. So when you hear like Iran's foreign minister says, no, we have to go back to the MOU, we have to make sure the United States meets every point of that MOU, and you have Scott Bessent saying, no, there will be no fees on the transiting from the Strait of Hormuz. What you have here is just negotiations out in public. People are establishing very outlandish and maximalist red lines and demands in hopes of being able to get a better deal in the final outcome. The bottom line is that objective reality, including that weapons shortfall that the U.S. is facing and the energy reserves that are declining, as well as the midterms that are coming up, are sort of forcing the U.S. hand right now. But let's caution here. Once those midterms are over, once the energy reserves are replenished, once the weapons are restocked after a little while, there could be another resumption of war by the United States. They could initiate military escalation again. This is definitely not over. There's still more than 2 years left in the Trump presidency.
Absolutely. And also, do you think these Oman talks could ultimately become more than a temporary shipping arrangement, potentially serving as the first step towards a wider US-Iran de-escalation, do you think? Or are the disagreements over sanctions, military pressure and freedom of navigation simply too deep?
I mean, it could lead to something. I kind of doubt that it will lead to anything very durable because if you look at the nature of the Trump administration, they basically don't even abide by deals with their own allies. If you look, they announced this big nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia. They were going to give nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. And the very next day, Donald Trump imposes new conditions, essentially making that deal null and void. So I don't think that the United States under Donald Trump is a very consistent or trustworthy interlocutor. And Iran, too, has a history of perceived mistrust on the part of the international community. A lot of countries do not trust its words, and they believe that it is essentially getting ready to reload. They think that the proxies that the Iranians operate are a threat to the region. They do not believe the Iranian claims of defense and self-defense. They are convinced that the Iranians are a nefarious actor. So I think there's going to be a lot of mistrust and maybe too much mistrust for a durable agreement on all sides. And here's an interview that I did about the latest from Yemen, where the conflict between the Houthis on the one hand and the Saudi-backed forces and Saudi Arabia on the other hand has really heated up in recent days.
Are we witnessing the collapse of Yemen's fragile truth as these events are progressing forward?
It does not appear to be helping. There does appear to be a real deterioration in the security situation. This is really a tragedy for Yemen. This war has been simmering for some time now. There have been various aspects of the conflict, including fighting between the Saudi-backed forces and the UAE-backed forces in the south. And now you have the resurrection of the main field, the main aspect of the conflict, this war between the Houthis and the Gulf-backed, internationally recognized government and its forces, this fight over Ma'arib province that has been going on for years, really, a fight for control of this province. And what the result is in general when the fighting flares up is more death, more disease, more deprivation for civilians, higher prices for the country's impoverished civilian population, a cutoff of supplies and humanitarian aid.
Are we looking at isolated clashes here, or are these the first signs of Yemen's civil war returning in full force?
We're still not sure of that. I think it's more than just isolated clashes. If you look at the broader context of the fighting between Yemenis, Houthis, and the Saudi forces over the last few weeks, the broader context even of Iran and the United States still with this lingering conflict. And this is part of that to some extent. This is a battle for influence and power between two different axes, the US-backed Saudi axis, as well as the Iranian-backed militias such as the Houthis and Hezbollah for control over this particularly important area. This is an area that not only gives you access to the crucial Saudi oil fields and oil infrastructure, but to the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, which is a crucial choke point from the Red Sea, giving access also to the Suez Canal. So this is part geopolitics, part local tragedy. People will suffer.
When we look at these recent escalations, how much of the 2022 truce actually remains intact after these recent attacks?
I don't think much of it remains intact, but I also think that there's been a reshuffling of the deck. For example, the United Arab Emirates, which used to be a main player in Yemen, is not that much of a player anymore. And the Saudi-backed government, the Saudi-backed government based in Aden, is a different cast of characters and so on. So I think that not only has the geopolitical context changed since 2022, you also have a different cast of characters that may just view the whole situation very differently when these elder leaders and military commanders fade from the scene and younger guns take their place. They tend to be more ambitious and aggressive. And so I think that more likely than not, much of that agreement is in tatters. Still, there is hope for a return to some semblance of a ceasefire.
The UN warned that the escalation threatens regional security, maritime navigation, and fragile peace efforts, urging all sides to exercise maximum restraint. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation has also condemned the attacks and expressed solidarity with Saudi Arabia. When we look at this, why should we say that? How can you say that? Why the Houthis are actually choosing to escalate this war now?
Well, it's really tough to say. And we don't have a lot of reporting on the ground, so we don't know what's going on. I wouldn't trust the Saudis. I wouldn't trust the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is a Saudi front group. I wouldn't even trust the UN Security Council at this point on this issue because it's basically doing the bid of the U.S. It basically have no mediating role anymore. They're not really trusted. So I don't understand what's happening on the ground. There's no journalists there. This is part of the tragedy of the world we are in now. So we don't know what provoked the Houthis or if they were not provoked. I think that the Houthis they claim that they were attacking preemptively because the Saudi-backed forces were building up their weapons and building up their preparations ahead of a potential attack. That could be a lie. That could be the truth. We just have no idea. What is for sure is that there is this broader regional contact.
The UN Security Council has strongly condemned these attacks. But does this condemnation have any deterrent value, according to you?
No, I don't think so. And I think that that is kind of a shame, because if they had a more measured statement, a more statement that would condemn both parties and urge restraint on all sides, they would maintain their credibility. But because they only condemn the Houthis, and this happens frequently with the Security Council these days, because of the nature of the Trump administration and their unsubtle efforts at coercive diplomacy, they put out these kinds of statements, not realizing that what they're really doing is reducing their leverage. No one takes the Europeans seriously anymore for this reason. No one takes the UN seriously anymore for this reason. When you become just a bootlicker for whoever is the power that is in the world, no one is going to take you seriously, especially if you're an insurgent power like Iran or the Houthis. You lose your credibility when you take the side of the superpower.
I have one more question for you, as we've just heard that parts of Saudi Arabia will actually hit. Now, if the Houthis continue attacking Saudi territory, what is Saudi Arabia's realistic next move?
It's a tough situation for Saudi Arabia. I think one of the reasons why you had this major defense accord signed today with Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Pakistan is they want to have a little bit more leverage on regional players. But the Saudis are in a little bit of a bind, because if they seriously escalate against Yemen's Houthis could very realistically target the Saudi oil facilities. And they could also ask Iraq's Shia militias, which have a clear line of sight right into those Saudi oil facilities from the deserts of central Iraq, to also join in the fight. And that would be very devastating for the Saudi economy and Saudi Arabia's future vision 2030 and their plans to become a more normal country in a really abnormal region at a very crucial and very tense time.
The UN is warning that this will threat like peace, regional security, and maritime navigation. So what is the one immediate step that must be taken to prevent Yemen from sliding back into a full-scale war?
Well, I mean, that's a little bit above my pay grade. Yeah, I'm not a diplomatic troubleshooter. I'll leave the really big decisions for that on the part of the UN and diplomatic powers. But like I said, if the UN had more credibility, if it didn't just immediately do whatever the Americans and the Saudi financiers of the UN wanted them to do and issue these statements, they would have a more crucial and more vital role as acting as a diplomatic interlocutor. I think that diplomatic interlocutors with credibility need to step in. Perhaps countries like Pakistan, perhaps even a country like India or Russia or China, which has a little bit more credibility. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where a lot of the diplomatic bandwidth in the world is already being used up in issues like Ukraine and Iran, and there's just not a lot of capacity on the part of the traditional diplomatic interlocutors. Hey, thank you so much for listening or watching. Again, apologies for the inferior production qualities in this makeshift studio of mine. My name is Borzu Daragahi. This is Badlands, and you can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. You can also find me on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and on Spotify.